Hey, what's going on? Shep and Iron Anchor Cycles back with another installation in our FXDX build series. So the last part that we shot, we just got our new camera. I'd mentioned that our last one took a shit and we got a new one. So we've just been figuring out the settings. I'm by no means a camera or video person, so much better with bikes than we are with cameras. So hopefully we'll do a little better on this one. I'm not sure how well the audio came out on that last one, but we've tried to make that work a little bit better this time around. So hopefully it will. Anyway, on to the work. Today, what we're going to be focusing on is continuing sort of where we left off. In our last part, we were dealing with bars, risers, all this stuff up here. And today, we're going to jump into dealing with the rest of the front end. So I think I mentioned on and off a few times, either in the intro or the last part, what our plans were going to be for what we were going to do here. I have that pretty much nailed down at this point, at least hopefully I do, since we're about to dive into it. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a little work on the front end. We're going to get our brakes set up. We're going to replace our rotors. And I think just as long as we've got the wheel off, I'm going to put a new tire on here as well. You know, this is one of those things, I don't know, we see it all the time with tires. Just because they're not worn out doesn't mean that they're good. You know, you can check your date code on your tires, and you know, we looked at these, and these tires are as old as this bike. These are the original tires on it. They're shot. Definitely have dry rot on them. They're not going to do what we want them to do, so we're gonna put a tire on. But anyway, I think I mentioned at one point earlier that we weren't necessarily going to go right away to doing anything with the front end, and we we're going to maybe ride it a little first. I changed my mind. We've got the bike on the lift. We're working on it. I'm just going to take care of what I want to take care of now. So I think I mentioned we're obviously not going to get rid of the DX front end. Can't bring myself to do that. It's decent. It's not as good as more modern stuff in the aftermarket, but what we're going to do is we're going to swap the springs out for a set of Racetech springs, and we're going to put heavier weight oil in. So hoping that will just stiffen this front end up a little bit and give us what we're looking for, at least in the short term. So I think some folks probably would like to see how one of these DX front ends comes apart. So I will definitely show you that. I don't know if we will fully disassemble it because the seals seem to be good. They're not leaking. But at least I'll show you what you need to do to get it the hard part apart, and then once that's done, it's more or less the same as any other front end. So I will be taking care of that in this video series. We'll be doing the brakes. So obviously these are just sort of mocked up in place. These are the Bagger Brembos that are on here. These are off of another bike that we had, so they've got old pads in them. We're going to change those pads because we're putting new rotors on. Want to keep everything nice and fresh. And then we did rebuild the master cylinder up here, and the reason we did that, number one, it was old and rebuilding a master cylinder didn't take very long, but also because this bike would have had .5 brake fluid in it, but because we were running .4 brake fluid in these calipers, which is how they started their life on a more modern bike, I just decided rather than take them all apart and flush everything out of there, we're just going to continue to run .4 fluid. The lines are new. These already had .4 in them, so the only thing is the master cylinder that had to get all that .5 flushed out of it so you wouldn't get any cross-contamination. So that's all ready to go. We're just going to need, like I said, change the pads, put some brake fluid in the master cylinder, bleed it, and do that. And then we're going to have our new rotors to go on as well. And I think I might have mentioned in the intro, but I'll kind of readdress it now. Why are we putting rotors on this bike? Well, it's because, and this is I think an overlooked detail when people do this swap, these calipers are a direct bolt-on to these Dyna front ends. You just need the correct mounting bolts for them. So Dynas have a long top bolt and a short bottom bolt. These brakes use 2 short bolts. So you can use that bottom bolt, but you got to get another shorty for the top. So they are a bolt-on. However, it's a bigger caliper, which is a good thing, but they're designed to run with 11.8-inch rotors, and these bikes all have 11.5-inch rotors. So we're putting 11.8-inch rotors on here so we can actually maximize the friction surface on the pads and get all the stopping power that these calipers are designed to deliver. So we're going to put those bigger rotors on this wheel. We're going to change the tire. We're going to do the brakes, the front end, put it back together. So shouldn't be a super long one for today. Once we get this front end done, hopefully we'll have some of our engine stuff back and we can start to dig into that. And then once that's done, we'll start working our way back to get some of the rest of the stuff on this bike done. But that's the plan for today. So if that interests you, stick along. And I'll make a call out now. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, make sure you go ahead and hit that button and do it for us. That's a big help. And I'm going to get reset and we'll start taking some stuff apart and show you how this all goes. So with the brake calipers dangling here, we just pulled the 2 bolts out. We've got them hanging on both sides. We're gonna go ahead and take the wheel off, and then we'll pull the fork legs down. This is all really simple, and I usually skip this part in every other video we do, but in the interest of full disclosure and step-by-step on this one, I'm gonna let you watch me do it. So we're gonna start by taking the axle nut off. Get the washers out of there. There's another one in there, which is sometimes hard to grab. You can either grab it with a magnet or it'll just fall out when you pull the axle. You gotta come over to the other side and loosen the pinch bolt. In the case of this particular bike, the pinch bolt is already loose. I'm not sure if I did that at some point or if it was just like that. But next will be to just push the axle out. Sometimes you gotta tap it with a rubber mallet. In our case, it's gonna slide out. So that was that washer I mentioned that goes with the bolt. And then on a non-ABS bike like this one, you'll just have a wheel spacer on each side. If you don't know how these are supposed to go, pay attention to the markings that are on them and put it back the same way, presuming that they were installed correctly, which may not always be the case. So we're gonna put them there. Take the wheel out. We'll come back to this after we do the front end. And now we can take our sliders out. I believe these are a T45. Yep. Okay. I like to break them both loose and then loosen one and then the other. And your fork will just slide right out. Okay. So there's one. Put this aside. And we'll do the other one. And there we go. So we got our legs apart, I should say our legs off. Got one of each. Hopefully you can remember which is right and which is left. If you can't, look at your caliper mounts. And I'm gonna take these over to the workbench and we'll take a look at doing the disassembly or partial disassembly of these, new springs, new oil, and we'll get them put back in here. So here we are with one of the fork legs clamped up in our suspension leg vise here, and I'm just gonna show you basically how to disassemble this. I'm gonna go as far as I need to go, maybe one step further. Basically, I'll get you to the point where it's basically the same, more or less, as just doing a regular, regular Harley leg. I think some people are maybe intimidated by all the rest of this and getting the cartridge out and all that stuff, and it's a little bit more involved, and if you have the right tools, it's not that big a deal. But anyway, for whatever it's worth, I'm gonna show you how to do it. So the first step here is there's a retaining pin. You know what, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit because not so important that you see my face, but maybe a little bit more important you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so as I said, we're gonna start here at the top. There is a little retaining ring that's right in here that goes around the rebound adjuster. And you just got to look around it and find where the gap in it is, which I can't find. There it is. So yours might be a little gummed up like mine. Get it to spin a little. Then you can kind of get in here with a pick, and you're just going to pry it out of this groove that it's in. There we go. Okay. Just work that around. Okay, got it out of the groove. It's just kind of caught on the cap here. There we go. Okay, so we're gonna get that little ring off, put that aside. Now what that ring's job is to prevent the preload adjuster from being able to thread off the top of the leg. So that's what we're trying to do here. So I'm gonna take a 7/8 wrench and I'm gonna start to unthread the preload adjuster. Okay, and once you get that up, just kind of pull on it. There's a couple seals there you're just working past, and we'll get that preload adjuster out, set it aside. Now, one thing here you might be looking at, you've got this little screw that connects the the rebound adjuster to the dampening rod assembly. You don't need to disassemble that, and there's really no reason to unless you've got a reason to. But for this particular job, not necessary. So once that preload adjuster is off, we're gonna come in and take the actual fork cap off, or I should say loosen it anyway, unthread it. Okay. All right, those can be a little tight. One thing to point out, you're gonna wanna use a deep socket to do this. A wrench, there's a very small flats on here. It looks like I can see, it looks like somebody tried to do this with a wrench once already and kind of marred this up a little bit. If you have a suspension wrench, like a spanner, that'll work too. We just don't have one that's this size, so we're just using a deep socket. All right, so once you do that, you're just gonna keep turning it until it's unthreaded. So now, and this is where this is obviously different than a regular fork leg, is the cap won't come off because it's connected to the damper rod. So the question is, how do you get it off? Well, here's where our first specialty tool comes in. So I'm gonna take this out of the vise that it's in, and I'm gonna bring it over to the spring compressor, and we'll get this taken apart. Okay, so here's the leg we were just working on, and here's the spring compressor. Spring compressor is just being held in a vise. This is actually a vise that has a set of Racetech jaws in it. These are an alternative method of holding a fork tube as compared to the one I was just using over there. We've got a bunch of different ones we've tried. I like that one the best. What I'm done here is just put this in this vise. You could use any one just to hold it in place. And to be honest, you don't even really need this in a vise. You can work with it on the ground or on the workbench. It just gets a little unwieldy. So what we're gonna do here is sit the fork leg down in here. Gonna drop the tube down. Now, basically what we're trying to do here is you'll see, I'm gonna zoom in again. Okay, so there we are zoomed in, fork leg sitting on the compressor tool. So what we're trying to do here is you got two holes in the collar here, one on each side. There's one on this side, and if I spin it around, well, you can see there's one on the other side. So you got a pin and a bolt here. So we want to get those into this, and we're going to then pull the spring compressor up, which is going to push down on the spring and allow us to get in here with a couple of wrenches. So I am going to bring this up, which is the other way. Okay, so I got that lined up. I'm gonna put this in here. And I mean, you can put a wrench in here and tighten this, but it doesn't need to be super tight, just enough to hold those pins in place. So now, as I continue to move up with the compressor, it's gonna be hard to hear me over the electric ratchet, but you'll see that the spring starts to compress and we're able to get some play up in here, which is what we need. Okay, and I'm gonna go a little bit more. Okay, so now, if I pull up on that, and just be careful with this, like this spring under tension can really do some damage if you're not careful. So we're gonna hold the preload adjuster, and I'm gonna push these pins up out of the way so we don't damage them. And grab this lock nut and just break that loose. And once that's loose, I'm just gonna hold this, you can turn your assembly and the fork cap will thread off the damper rod, and the damper tube itself is gonna come out along with it because we didn't disconnect anything. So, sorry, we're still pretty zoomed in. It's a little hard to see that maybe. So now, just pull this washer out as well. There's a spacer above and below this cup. And now what I'm gonna do is just turn the ratchet the other way and take the tension off of this. now this will slide out. There's that other washer I mentioned. Just don't lose track of that. And now we've got our fork leg free. I'm just gonna, we'll unbolt this. Might need a wrench to get it off now that it's been tightened a little bit, but I'll try and grab it. There we go. Okay, so there's that collar. Washer above and below it. I'm going to take all of this back over to our other work area and continue to work on it, and we'll get this back, zoom back out so you can see. All right, so now that we've got the fork cap removed, and I'll just kind of show you, now you can see a little better here what that looks like. Sorry, we got these in the wrong hands. So there's the cap that we were trying to get off, and obviously it's got the damper connected to it that ran all the way down through the damper tube inside the leg. So we're going to set this aside for the moment. And looking now at the fork leg, this should look pretty familiar if you've ever done a Harley fork leg before. You've got your lower, upper spring sitting here and it's filled with oil. So the next step is, of course, to dump the oil out of the fork. So I'm not going to do that on camera. I'm just going to walk over to our waste drum, dump that oil out, leave the spring over there because we're not going to be reusing it. And I'll come back over and we'll continue with getting this thing ready to go. Okay. So with the spring taken out, all the oil dumped out, basically what we're left is the damper still connected in here, and then we've got our fork legs. So this is more or less the same procedure to get the damper out, although the damper is very different than it is in a regular one, regular leg, I should say. Same principle applies. Undo the Allen bolt from the bottom of the fork leg. It's much easier to do this with an impact tool than it is with like a ratchet because there's nothing really to hold pressure, so the impact tool helps a lot in any leg, not just this one. So I'm going to do that. Oh. Got to take your pinch bolt out first. Okay. And you'll notice, of course, the bolt is different as well. On a regular fork leg, it would be just a regular bolt. But here you've got sort of like a banjo bolt kind of deal. All right, so now what I'm going to do is take this, if you flip it upside down, and I'm going to do this over the, well, we can do it right here. If we make a mess, we make a mess. Turn this upside down, and our damper will come out. So this is obviously still covered in dirty oil, so we're going to put this out of the way to clean. But now, what you're left with, other than the fact that you've got your compression adjuster here on the outside of the fork, that's here, is pretty much just a very standard fork leg assembly. So if you were trying to change your seals, at this point, it would be exactly the same as doing any other fork leg. You pop your cap off, you take the retaining ring out, dust seal, pull your seal out, all that, clean it up, look at the bushings, put it all back together, and then you'd kind of get back to this point. Now, for us, I'm not going any further on the disassembly than this, and the reason is because the forks aren't leaking. I could pretty quickly just change the seals and put them in for safekeeping, but honestly, there's not a lot of miles on this bike, although it's pretty old. I'm just gonna roll the dice and cross my fingers and say I think the seals are good. I don't know, I could be less lazy and just do it, but I'm gonna just keep rolling because there was no evidence of any leaks on this. So maybe they were changed at one point, I don't know. So from here, what we wanna do is do a really good job, a thorough rinsing out of all of this and all the parts that we took out, right? So all that old, dirty, kind of grayish oil, we want that out. So we'll get a suspension parts cleaner, we're gonna flush everything through until we get clear fluid coming out. We're gonna blow it out with compressed air, make sure it's all dry, get all that cleaner out of there, and we'll be ready to go with the reassembly of everything. So we're gonna get everything cleaned up. I'm gonna do the other leg off camera, and then we'll get back here and we'll do the installation and we'll keep rolling. Okay, so we are ready to start putting together the new components now that we got everything cleaned off. So the first step is, this is a little bit easier. I'll start by saying, if you're just reinstalling stock stuff, you just clean it up and the installation's the reverse removal, that whole deal. But if you're doing the Race Tech stuff, which I will say, I mean, Race Tech is a big name. They do a lot of stuff. I'm sure their stuff is great. I just don't love doing it because I I don't know. I just haven't had the best success with it compared to some of the other stuff we do. Like Olin's is obviously our #1, and there's a bunch of other, you know, good stuff out there. Nevertheless, I'm deviating a little bit, but basically, so this is a Racetech spring, and I don't know, I didn't show you the original ones that came out, but the original ones are longer. And what Racetech basically does is they give you these sort of universal length springs and then a hunk of PVC tube, and you have to figure out how big a spacer you need to cut out of that PVC tube. And it can be a little bit confusing. There's these instructions that come with it with different diagrams of forks, and you have to figure out what kind you have, and there's a QR code, and you can scan that and go figure your other stuff out. And ultimately what we're trying to do is you're trying to set the correct preload on the fork. And at least on these DX front ends, you've got a preload adjuster, so if you don't get it exactly right, you know, you've got some up and down to it. But in any event, for these DX cartridges, these are an internal top-out spring cartridge. And what that means is that unlike a traditional damper fork that Harley has, you know, where it's got that little spring that sort of sits in the bottom and it comes out after you pull the damper out. On these, and I'm not sure if the camera will be able to see it, but if I pull on this, that you can see there's some spring to it. Hopefully you can see it. If you got one of these, you'll feel it. That means it's an internal top-out spring cartridge, which leads you to a specific set of instructions from Racetech. And ultimately, they tell you that you're going to figure out what your preload is by taking some measurements. And the first measurement is you are measuring with the fork cap attached to the cartridge. That would be basically putting this into here and tightening this down, and then you're going to measure from the bottom where it would catch the bottom of the cap down to here. That is going to be your set length, they call it. Then you're going to measure the spring, and that's your free length, and you take the difference between those two. And ultimately what you get to is, at least the math that we came up with, is that we need an 85 millimeter spacer to get to the 25 millimeters of preload, which is what they're suggesting in their instructions. So I did go ahead and already cut this down to that size. That's 85 millimeters. And so this plastic tube now is going to live in the cartridge with the spring. And that's not unusual if you've done forks before to do preload spacers. This is pretty common using PVC. Like if you're doing like, you know, 2 over, 4 over, the chopper shit, you know, a 6 over front end, just get longer tubes. You leave all your regular internals and just stack a spacer in there and you're good to go. So basically, that needs to now go in along with it. And it comes with some additional washers that essentially are going to go around this tube as it sits in there. And then obviously these are going to be additional preload. Obviously anything you stack in there is going to add preload. So you take all that into account when you do your math. So basically what we're going to do from here is we're going to install the damper into the fork. So I guess I should say the cartridge, not the damper, but just used to Harley stuff. All right, so that's in there now, and then we're going to take the bolt with a new copper washer on here. I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on there, and then we will tighten this down. We can see that. I like to start it by hand just to get it kind of going, and then put the impact on there to get it fully seated. Okay, so there is a torque spec for that. I've just had luck with the gun on this second setting, working really well. So now that that's in place, the next thing we're going to do is get some oil in here and set it to the correct length. Now, not sure what I did with my tool here. So if you've seen any of our videos doing, I'm just going to move this down. If you've seen any videos doing our Olin's shocks, we've got a damper tube rod here that you can screw onto the end and hold the damper tube up and use it to move it up and down. This is not the same threads on this DX front end. There is a tool for this, and I don't have it. But what I have sort of done is we just use a little magnet here, and you can grab that and pull it up. And the magnet's pretty strong on this, and it seems to work pretty well. So that's what we're going to do in order to you know, move this around as we need to. So What I'm going to do here is start by putting some oil in. All right. And then I'm going to grab that damper with this magnet and start to move that up and down. All right. Hopefully that microphone picked up. You can start to hear the difference, and then you can also see that fluid coming out. So I did that. Now I'm going to move this up and down as well. You can hear that gurgling. That would be all that fluid displacing air, making bubbles. Fluid levels drop down pretty good now. I'm going to add some more. Okay. Keep going. Okay. And I think we're golden. So now we got to do is set the level, and I've got my adjuster, or I should say, what do we call this? Fork oil level tool. This is from Motion Pro. The setting for this is 128 millimeters. Just gotta love that they give you a measurement that's not something that you're gonna find on the scale here. So basically we just used a caliper and just set it to 128 millimeters and then just set the height on this accordingly. So stick this in here, the fork all the way bottomed out, the cartridge bottomed out, and we will pull fluid out until that level is correct. Whoop. This 20 weight oil is pretty thick, so it can be take a little bit of kind of force to get this tool to work. It's a little different, like when we do the Olin's forks. That oil is much thinner, and so we don't have quite as much of an issue. So I'm just taking the extra fluid. Am I on camera there? I am. Cool. Taking the excess fluid, just putting it into this container here. And we'll go one more time, and that should get it. And there we go. Cool. So now that our oil level is set correctly, just gonna put this back in there. All right, try to find the top for this so I don't spill it everywhere. Well, at least put it out of the way. So we've got our oil level set. The next thing we have to do is start installing the components. So the first thing we're gonna put in here is the spring. All right, and now is not a bad time to grab that damper. Probably before doing the spring would be better. So see, I've got a hold on that cartridge so I can grab it as needed. So what we're gonna do from here is we're gonna take some of these washers. We're gonna put one on top of the spring here, followed by that new preload tube, followed by another washer. Get that out of here. Magnet's kind of jacking things up. Followed by this original spacer. And there's going to be another washer that goes on the top, but that doesn't need to go on until we put the fork cap on. So the fork cap obviously is connected to this rod, so I'm going to take that last washer and I'm just going to slide it on here. So that will go on. Now, obviously, if you remember, to get this thing threaded on, we need to compress the springs. We're going to go back over the spring compressor, get this set in there, compress it up, put the cap on, decompress it. So I'm going to walk over, do that, and I'll reposition the camera so I can show you how that goes. Okay, So we've got the fork here with all those parts we just put on. I've still got my little magnet here on the damper rod. And so just like we did before, we're going to take this spacer collar that's got these holes in it and get that lined up with the pins and get it ready to go. So I will say another reason I just don't love this setup is this whole stack of bullshit of washers and preload spacers and whatever. This is pretty inelegant. I think a cartridge that's just designed properly for the bike is probably a little better. I'm curious to see how these springs are and see if we're going to get any benefit for what we're going through to do this. So I'm just going to snug this up. So critically, you want to make sure, number one, I didn't mention, when you cut this PVC tube, you really got to get it dead straight so that that cut is perfectly parallel with the other side. And it's all 90 degrees to the tube. Otherwise, it's gonna line up crooked and things are gonna rub and you're not gonna like it. So what I'm doing here is just getting all these little washers and everything centered and lined up. And then we'll give it a little bit more tightening and we'll see how it starts to compress. Okay, pulling up on our little magnet, almost there. Just got a little more we gotta go. Okay, and a little bit more. So I'm basically just trying to get it. I went a little further than I needed to. I'm trying to get it so that lock nut, which is all the way bottomed out there, is above this collar. So with that there, I'm going to take the magnet off and hold it up with my finger. And now I'm going to grab the rod, put it in there, and start to thread that on. And there we go. And now grab that bottom nut and that. And we're going to tighten that nut onto the cap. Like that. All right. And so now, keeping all of this as lined up as we can, we'll back the tension off and let it seat onto the cap. Okay. And there we go. Sorry about that. Had a battery change we had to do there real quick. But what I was saying was before this preload adjuster goes back on, you may remember this little keep the top of the pizza box from touching the cheese on your pizza guy. So this was inside of here originally, and we had to watch out for it as we were putting the wrenches on to take the cap off. Well, you can take it out once it's all apart, and now you don't have to worry about bending these and messing them up with the wrench. So, man, I got bad fingers today. So we're going to put this back in so that when you spin that preload collar, it actually does something. There we go. And then what you've got is a washer that came out, so that's going to go in next. And then we've got two O-rings that need to be lubricated on this. There's one on the inside of it and one on the outside. So I'm just going to... I've got a little bit of fork oil in the cap here. I'm just wiping it on. All right. So then that guy will slide over. Okay. And you can start to turn that by hand. I should have a wrench here. And your preload, ultimately, you're going to set by the sag on the bike once you get everything back together. For me, I'm just setting it to a kind of known quantity to start off with. Last thing is you got to get your little lock ring back on here. So that's just going to slide over the top. And just walk that down into its groove and get that seated, and you're good to go. So that's basically that. Just unlock this, open it up, and we've got our fork fully back together. New heavyweight oil, 20 weight, along with new Racetech springs. So we've got this one done. Like I said, the other one I'm going to do off camera because it's exactly the same thing. And we'll get these put back on the bike and we'll keep moving along. Okay, so next step, put those fork legs, we actually just threw them on the bike, slide them in, tighten the pinch bolts to 30 to 35 foot-pounds, good to go. We're gonna move on to doing the wheel and get that put on. So first thing I'm gonna do is get ready to install these new rotors we got. I'll show you these a little bit more up close when we put them on, but these are super cool. They're from TC Brothers, they're floating rotors. They're not expensive, and they're exactly what we need, which is 11.8-inch rotors. And keeping with the trend, we're not trying to put, you know, $700 rotors on. We're just trying to put something on that's going to be functional and do the job and look pretty cool too. So, no particular order here. I'm going to take these rotors off, and then I'm going to do the tire, and then I'm going to put the new rotors on. Not really any reason for that. You could do any of this in any order. That's just how I'm going to do it. Okay, so there's one. All right. And I will say, there is really nothing wrong with these rotors. These are not going in the trash. May have a use for them, but for the moment, they're just being kept in the stock takeoff box with everything we're taking off this. Okay, now another thing I like to do here is, because my memory sucks, is draw some arrows for rotational direction on something you're not going to see or that you can wipe off easily. Again, I mean, I've got this all on video, so I could probably just go back and check the video, but it's just easier to do that. All right, so let's get this tire off. All right, so tire's on, it bounces. Just kidding, that doesn't mean anything. All right, so let's go ahead and put some rotors on. All right, so get a little closer look. It's that TC Brothers 11.8-inch front rotor. These are cool, I like them. I haven't installed these in a while. I can't remember the last bike we did them on, but I dig them. Because the price is right. I think it's one thing TC Brothers I think really does the right way is their stuff is very fairly priced, all of it. Okay, so go ahead and get these screws put back in. I'm actually, before we put this even on, I'm looking in here, there's some blue Loctite and all that junk. I'm gonna turn the camera off just because you don't need to see me clean out a bunch of threads, but I'm gonna clean these threads out on both sides, and then we'll come back, put the rotors on, and we'll get them torqued down and get this reinstalled. All right, I figured what the hell, the camera's here. You can watch me clean some threads out. And if you want to fast forward, I won't be offended. So I'm just gonna put our little thread chase in here. And obviously what we're using here is not a tap. We're not trying to cut new threads or anything like that. We're just using a thread chase, which is gonna get all that old Loctite and junk and everything else out of there. So that new hardware will spin in nicely. So, threads cleaned out, ready to throw the rotors on here, get some bolts, and get a torque wrench, and we'll get this done. All right, so got a new rotor here, threads all cleaned out. There's not really an alignment with these. The spokes don't match any of it. I'm just trying to see if there's one particular way that looks better than the others. Seems to be about all the same. All right, so I'm gonna take our hardware with some blue Loctite added to it and get that started. Got my hand a little filled with Loctite here. All right, kind of got a lot on that one. All right. So I'm going to start these. And then I'm going to torque them. I'm going to do 24 foot-pounds on these. Okay, so this is the point in the video where our microphone stopped working. So I guess we still haven't figured these sound issues out, but maybe one of these days we'll get it 100% right. So we finished up putting the rotors on, and now obviously we've got the wheel on the balancer. What I'm doing here is basically setting the settings on the machine up for the wheel that we've got on there. So that would be distance from the machine, the width of the wheel, and then the size of the wheel. And then we'll give it a first spin and see what we get for the initial balance. So obviously what we've come up with, which I was pretty pleased about, was that it's asking for no weight at all on this particular wheel. Now, we get this maybe 5–10% of the tires that we do don't need any weight on them. They're just perfectly balanced. And what I'm doing here is just spinning it one more time to confirm that and make sure that that is in fact the case. And we are finding that it's still 0, so we're good to go with no wheel weights on this. The wheel is perfectly balanced. All right, so now we've got the wheel back set up in the bike, and we're gonna get ready to just get it reinstalled. Obviously, what I'm pointing out there is that you got to have your original spacers in the correct orientation, and obviously dropping one on the ground there. But basically what you want to do is once you have them cleaned off, get them lined up with the wheel in the between the fork, and then you can get your axle put in there. And obviously what I've done here, and you can see in the video, is we've put some new anti-seize on that axle after cleaning it off, and the axle is going to just slide right through. So I'm pointing out here that the front fender needs to be off in order to get the wheel to go on. This is pretty unique to the 39mm Dynas. Most other Harleys, the fender can stay on, the wheel will clear, but the bolts, or the nuts, I guess, from the fender mount won't clear the tire on the 39mm Dynas. So with everything lined up and in place, and I think I'm going to just drop the spacer again on the other side. There we go. So axle goes through, And then from there, I'm going to raise the bike up a little bit. This is just a me thing. I like to get everything, kind of the weight of the wheel onto the axle to make sure everything turns freely before we start to tighten anything down. So what I'm going to do over here now is go ahead and just thread those two, the washer, lock washer, and nut back on and get it nice and snug. And then we're going to grab a wrench in order to get it tight, and then that'll be followed by the torque wrench. So see here, I get it snugged up. Everything's still turning freely, no binding. You kind of want to check that, just make sure it's all correct. So once that's done and you've got everything snugged in place and there's no binding, get your torque wrench and do your final torque. And in most cases, which I neglected to do here, you just need to grab a drift or a big screwdriver, something to hold the axle on the other side so it doesn't spin, and then you can give that final torque. Okay, so once the axle has been tightened, you're going to set your pinch bolt. Now, in different models, this is done a little bit differently. In the case of the dual disc Dynas, particularly these 39mm Dynas, there's a specific setting that you need to do. So what you can see I'm doing here is taking a 7/16 drill bit and using that to press the leg against. So this is not the same as some of the other bikes where you're going to press the leg inward so that it fills the gap, if there is one, between the leg and the spacer. You actually need to make sure that that gap is there because there's such close clearance between the leg and the hardware on the rotor that if you don't have this set correctly, the wheel won't spin. Those bolts will actually contact the lower leg. The other thing that this is important for is making sure that your brake disc is aligned with the caliper, and we'll get to that just a minute when we get back to doing the brakes. But so here what I've done is set that distance using that using that drill bit, and then making sure that I can still get the drill bit out, that everything spins, and then we're good to go. Okay, so we're ready to roll with changing out the pads in these calipers, and then we'll get them mounted back up, and we'll get them filled up and bled. So first thing we're gonna do is just pop the covers off here. You can just kind of stick anything in here. These will pop right off. Okay, and make sure, obviously if you're using these calipers, there's a retaining pin or clip right here. Just take a look and make sure if you got something like that, you take it out. If you just start turning on this screw here without taking that clip out, it'll bind up and you can get it all galled and you might never get it apart. So that's that. So next thing is we're gonna take this pin out. This is a little easier to do sometimes with the caliper still on. So if you're in a situation where your calipers are on and you're changing your brake pads, just crack that screw loose first, just because it can be a little tight just to get it started. Obviously ours just came right apart, so no big deal. So, and then actually, you know what I'm gonna do here? Before we actually take that out, I'm gonna, knowing that these pads are going in the garbage, I'm just gonna come in here and use the pads to push the pistons back in the caliper. So obviously by doing this with a screwdriver, we're destroying the pads, but like I said, they're going in the garbage anyway, so no big deal. All right. Okay. Got that. Now we'll take our pin out. Okay. And the pads should just kind of fall out. So there's one, and the other's a little stuck. There we go. There's two. Now, figuring out how the pads go back in is not the hardest thing in the world, but if you just want to be sure, just kind of leave them oriented the way they came out, and then you'll know how to put the new ones in. So while you got this apart, you can kind of look through here and make sure it's clean. These were really just rebuilt, so I know there's shouldn't be any issues here, and they're really not dirty at all. You know, this is one of those situations where if your pistons are sticking because they're dirty, it will cause your brakes to not work super well, and you might have a really long throw in the lever, things like that. You can take this opportunity to clean this really well. So In our case, we're good to keep going. Grab a new set of pads. We're just running DP's pads. We carry those, we sell a lot of them. So I'm gonna take these pads, kind of orient them the way that they were when they came out. I'm gonna stick one in on one side. And one in on the other side. And should be good to go. A little note, Harley service manual is going to tell you to replace this pin every time you change your brake pads. To be totally honest, I don't know why. These pins don't really get that much abuse. And so what I tend to do is just look at them, and if it looks fine, we'll just put it back in. If it shows any signs of wear or anything like that, we can replace them, but in this case, looks more than perfect. So we're gonna throw that in, and I'm just gonna snug this down, put our pin in, and then slide caliper over, throw our mounting bolts in, okay. And now with that kind of held in place, I'm just going to give this a little, these do not have to be super tight. Just give it a little turn, good to go. All right, so I'm going to walk over to the other side, and what I want to look at through the front here is to make sure that the disc itself is evenly centered inside the caliper. On this side, you have the ability to move the leg around a little bit. On the other side, you don't. So this is the one where it's critical, just to make sure you got it right. And it looks like, as I suspected, we could probably move this leg out just a hair. In here, you got a little bit of rubbing there on the brake pad, but we'll get the calipers, we'll get it seated, and we'll get this fixed. So I'm gonna pause on that for the moment. I'm gonna come over and I'm just gonna put the pads in on the other side. I'm not gonna show that, it's exactly the same thing. And then we'll come back and get all this stuff straightened out. Okay, so with both the calipers now back on, we tightened down the mounting bolts, and I did just loosen up the pinch bolt here and just recenter that caliper on the rotor and then tighten it back down. Everything's good, spins freely. What I've done now is just lowered the bike down slightly to put a little bit of pressure on the front wheel so that the front end doesn't shake around while we're up here working on the master cylinder. Now, obviously, depending on the kind of bars that you have and how your hand controls are set up, the angle that the bars will need to be to get your master cylinder level might be different. So we just kind of turn the wheel a little bit to the left, and it's not gonna move. So basically what we gotta do here is just fill this. Now, this particular master cylinder cover says use .5 fluid on it. We'll know that there's .4 in here, but I think at some point down the road when I find something that we're changing, we have an extra one of these that's a .4 cover, I'll change it, just because I would hate for someone else to be servicing this bike and see that this says .5 and not check the fluid, which we always do, but I think a lot probably don't, and pour .5 fluid and have them mixed together and really do a number on the brake system. So typically what we do when we service a bike is, if we're flushing the brake fluid, we'll take a little syringe, we'll pull a little bit of fluid out, and we'll check and see whether it's 4 or 5. You can't tell by the color, you have to really check it. For us, the easiest way to do it is take whatever brake fluid you think is in there, pour a little bit of that with what you pulled out of here into a cup and see if it mixes together. You'll see really quickly if it does or it doesn't. .4 and .5 brake fluid are like oil and water. You'll see them bubble and separate. So in any event, enough of that little PSA. I'm gonna put a little fluid in here and we'll start to bleed this. I'll leave the camera running. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see exactly what I'm doing or not, but we use a vacuum bleeder from Snap-on. You can do this with a Mighty Vac. It's a little hand pump. You can get them at Harbor Freight. They're not expensive. It's an awesome tool to have. We've got one of those around here somewhere too, we use for other things. But the old method of, pump the brake lever, open the bleeder screw, close it, pump it up again. It works if you're trying to get the last little bit of air out, and we'll do a little manual bleed sometimes at the very end. But if you're trying to pull a whole bunch of fluid through empty lines, one, it might not work at all doing it that way, and two, if it does, it's going to take a long time. So vacuum bleeder is our way of doing it. So I'm going to go ahead and put this aside, and we'll get started. Okay, so after we do the initial kind of bleed through with the vacuum bleeder, we'll start to see if we can make some pressure, and we've definitely got a lever now. When you're doing this new stuff, there can be a couple little things you might have to do sometimes. Without ABS, this is pretty easy. You're just pulling through straight. With ABS, you kind of have to work through the whole pump and everything like that, so it can take a little longer, but the reality is, like, if you're not getting a pedal, just keep bleeding. There's not really any other trick or shortcut. We've had ones where we keep going and going and going, you go through half a bottle of fluid and there's no pedal, and then all of a sudden you get that last bubble that was kind of trapped in there. You know, you would think if you pulled enough fluid through that you've gotten fluid from here all the way down to there, the volume of which are the lines that, you know, all the air bubbles would necessarily have to be gone. Well, what can happen is a bubble can get hung up in a corner on an edge, something like that, and it's just got to be kind of moved through. But this is actually starting to feel really just about perfect right now. I'm still seeing a couple little bubbles here in the master cylinder. So basically, you know, you got to bleed the whole system out, obviously, and get all the air out of there too. But you can sometimes get air trapped up in here. You might have to crack the bleeder screw open and kind of manually bleed that, which we'll do from time to time. But in this particular case, this feels really good. And I think we might be just about done. One thing I like to do after we've done the automatic vacuum bleed is do one quick manual bleed on each side, the old school way, just to kind of take a look and make sure that no air comes out of there, just to confirm we're 100% fine. And if we're having any issues, we'll do a little manual bleed at the banjo bolt on the master cylinder, but like I said on this one, I don't think we're gonna have to do that. This feels very, very good. So I'm gonna do that one little last bleed. I'll show you that actually. Can't hurt. I'm just gonna put a little more fluid in here. Okay. So the way we do that is we want to take the air pressure, the vacuum I should say, off. Now, we're just going to let this go into the hose that we've got here. You can do this with just a regular tube on it. But what I'm going to do is put this tube with no vacuum pressure behind it back on here. And I'm going to put pressure on the lever. And I'm going to open the screw, watch the fluid come out, see that there's no bubbles in it, close the screw, and then release the lever. Now, you might take a couple clicks to get this back up to pressure, but we're good here. So I'm happy with this side. I'm gonna turn the vacuum on just to kind of not spill this. Okay, put our cover back on. And I'm going to come around and do the same thing on the other side. Okay. If you haven't done this before or you're not comfortable with it, doing this with two people can be easier, just so you don't spill anything or you don't accidentally pull your master cylinder dry. But for me, done it a few times, no big deal. Okay, that side looked good too. So I'm going to release that lever and we're golden. So, you know, the teeniest little bubbles still kind of coming out of that master cylinder reservoir. This little kind of like release I'm doing here, this is just kind of knocking any bubbles that are in that master cylinder chamber out. Kind of do this at the end. Perfect. All right, so we've got a pedal. Don't see any more bubbles coming. We're good to go. So I'm just gonna put that cover back on the master cylinder and our front end will be as good as done. So new springs, new oil in the forks, got our new rotors on, new pads, got the brake system nice and bled, .4 brake fluid in there. So we're ready to go here. So I think that's gonna be the end for this segment because we kind of did everything we need to do on the front end. I'm gonna put the front fender back on. I'm not gonna show you that because honestly I don't even know where it is. So I'm gonna go find it and throw that back on and front will be done. I think our next segment back will probably be getting back to the motor and then we'll work our way back from the primary and then we'll start to do the stuff on the rear end and get all that stuff squared away. So we'll see you next time and hopefully you guys are enjoying the series. If so, make sure to drop us a like and let us know if you want to see anything else. Thanks.